welcome to another discussion on Filipino psychology. And for this time, let's talk about the rise of Filipino psychology. Right? We are already done with the timeline and the four affiliations. Now, let's have this topic. Right? So, Dr. Alfredo Lagmay and faculty started to question the applicability of Western theories and tools in the Philippine setting and doubted the replicability of research results obtained from the West. Okay, so this was the start, the questioning of the applicability of Western theories. Okay, is it really applicable for the majority of the Filipinos or not? Okay, also, Enriquez, on the other hand, raised questions about the validity of Western psychological concepts and their methodologies. Okay? He advocated for a Filipino psychology that would be based on the experience, ideas, and orientation of the Filipinos. Now, as we all know, here in the Philippines, in Asia in general, we are known as collective countries. No? And on the other hand, Western people are more of they are more of like individualistic. Now, um, our experience from them, okay, our own experience is different from them, okay, by that being a collectivist country, right? Now, so the replicability and the validity, is it really valid for us to use Western theories? And is it, can we replicate it, okay, here in the Philippines to be used, okay? So that's the start, okay? That's the start of Filipino psychology, wherein when Enriquez started this, okay, it's a mere questioning of the applicability of Western psychology. That's why they created Filipino psychology, right? Now, Torres, on the other hand, identified Filipino psychology not only as an attempt to arrive at culturally appropriate explanations of Filipino behavior, but also as a form of resistance to the hegemony of psychological literature from the West. Okay, so it's not only about questioning the replicability and the validity, but then um, Torres here identified Filipino psychology. Okay, and it's not an attempt. Okay, it's not only an attempt. Okay, but then this form of psychology that we have is a form of resistance. Okay, not totally resisting from the Western theories, but then creating our own. Okay, for us to be known that we have our own psychology. That's why in 1976, Enriquez founded the PSSP or Pambansang Samahan sa Psikologiyang Pilipino or the National Association for Philippine Psychology. Okay? So in January, that's in January 1976, with the objectives of inquiry and clarification of the value and nature of Filipino personality and consciousness and the development of studies towards a more scientific universal psychology. Right? Now, other developments included the development of an indigenous measure of personality, and we mentioned this already when we talk about the timeline of Filipino psychology. The PUP or Panukat ng Ugali at Pagkatao. And not only the PUP, no? There were intelligence tests that was created, okay, and other more tests, right? Now, um, the development of indigenous research methods considering and emphasizing the relational distance, okay, between researcher and research participants. Now, when we talk about research methods, and we will discuss this later on, the researcher and the research participants, okay, according to Enriquez and other Filipino psychologists, okay, here in the Philippines, there should be no distance between the two. Okay, so there should be an equality of status. Okay, so the researcher is not higher than the participants. Okay, and other development is the development of an undergraduate course in Filipino psychology. That's why all schools here in the Philippines, okay, the Commission on Higher Education said that all Filipinos taking up psychology and other related courses will take Filipino psychology, right? So it's an undergraduate program, right? Now, the publication of several books of readings on Sikolohem Filipino, which greatly facilitated the teaching of the course and ultimately the establishment of a graduate program specializing in Filipino psychology as an area of study. In our school, the University of the Cordilleras, we don't offer yet, okay, Filipino psychology, but maybe later on, maybe one of you would be working on or would be having masters in psychology, and maybe you can start in our school, okay. But then, of course, the University of the Philippines is the one offering this subject, the masters in Filipino psychology, right? Now, let's talk about Filipino psychology after Enriquez. Okay, so after the death of Enriquez in 1994, okay, Filipino psychology was considered orphan, or it was orphaned, and none of his followers or subordinates appeared ready to step on his extremely large shoes. Okay, when we say extremely large shoes, it's a big responsibility to take. Sorry, umiiyak yung baby ko, no? But then, anyways, now, the issues of succession, okay, the need for reorganization, the need to finally confront basic issues like resources to stay afloat, and other organizational issues had to be resolved first. Okay, so it was resolved then. So the task fell on the shoulders of Grace Dalisay and subsequently Elizabeth Marcelino, now when she got married, now De Castro. No? They are both former students and they became colleagues of Virgilio at the University of the Philippines. Okay, so sila ang nagpatuloy, and now they are still continuing to work on to the development of Filipino psychology. Right? Now, what are the characteristics of Filipino psychology as an indigenous Asian psychology? Okay, let's talk about its emphasis. Number one is the emphasis on identity and national consciousness. Okay, when we say emphasis on identity and national consciousness, somehow some Filipinos, okay, are losing their identity as Filipinos, and our nationalistic views are somehow swayed. No? So we still look on to some countries like the US. Okay, we look up to these countries because we think they have advanced or they are more developed than our country. Okay, another emphasis is on the social awareness and involvement that we should be aware of what's happening around us politically, economically, etc., etc., and we should be involved. Okay, and especially nowadays that the election is coming up, and it's the national election for the presidency and the lower positions. Uh, Dito natin may exercise ang ating right as Filipinos to be socially aware of who to vote, okay? And for us to be involved in the development of our society, right? Now, um, psychology of language and culture as well, okay? Applications and bases of Filipino psychology in health practices, agriculture, art, mass media, religion, okay, etc., etc. So, um, to have an social awareness and involvement when it comes to health practices, agriculture, art, because this is like Filipinos are fond of, or majority of our Filipinos, okay, or our countrymen, okay, are living, okay, or working on the agriculture industry, okay. Some are on the arts, mass media, religion, etc., etc. Right now, number two is the methods of investigation. Okay, number one here, it encourages cross-indigenous method, meaning to say we look at different concepts from different perspectives in different ethnic groups, that we do not only look on to a specific group of people or ethnic group, and we take those concepts or constructs and uh, create it in a general perspective. No, it should be created in a cross indigenous method, okay, from one culture to another or from one ethnic practices to another. Okay, another one here is multi method, multi language approach, meaning to say, here in the country that we are multilingual, no? That from north to south we have different languages, and when we talk about methods of investigation or researches, okay, we should use the language of the specific society that we are studying. Okay? And you might be asking, paano naman kaming hindi namin alam? What if we don't know their language? Okay? There's now the here comes now the intervention of the barangay captain or someone who can really translate the materials that you have, okay, and tell it to the people. Okay. Next is the appropriate field methods. That here in our country there are some ethnic groups who are, when they are studied, they are quite shy. Now, what are the appropriate methods that you should be using? Like, are you going to use pakikisama, pakikiramdam, etc., etc.? Later on, when we talk about the research methods, we'll be looking at those. No. Next is lastly the total approach or the triangulation method. Meaning to say, when we talk about triangulation method, we use all the three mentioned methods: the cross indigenous method, multi method, multi language approach, and the appropriate field methods. Right now, let's talk about the areas of protest of Filipino psychology. Number one here is the psikolohiya ng pagbabagong isip. And it's basically saying that Filipino psychology is against the perpetuation of colonial status of the Filipino mind. Meaning to say, we are, in Filipino psychology, we are contradicting, or we do not look at colonial status. Okay? Or, I mean, we look at our own, okay, instead of um, looking up to those other societies who are advanced. Okay. Second here is Psikologiyang Malaya. It's against the imposition to a third world country of psychologists developed in industrialized countries. As we've mentioned earlier, this is one of the protests of Dr. Lagmay and Dr. Enriquez, no? Or Doc E, that there are some concepts that are not really valid and not reliable, and it should not be replicated here in our country. Okay? And lastly, we have here Psikolohiyang Mapagpalaya, and that's against the exploitation of masses. And Filipino psychology is aiming to give equality to everyone. Okay, that there's no one culture that is higher than the other culture or other ethnic groups. Okay, now when we talk about psychological practice, okay, Filipino psychology endorses the conceptualization of psychological practice in a Philippine context. Like, example, livelihood psychology instead of industrial psychology. Okay? Industrial psychology is a Western concept. Or the health psychology instead of clinical psychology. Okay? So we also look at folk practices or indigenous techniques of healing. So those are the things that we should be looking at. Okay? Now, let's take a look at to the some issues, no, when it comes to Filipino psychology. Right. So let's take a look at science and humanism issue. Okay. So scientific. Okay. On the science humanism issue. Okay. Psikolohiyang Pilipino is concerned with both. Right. So scientific and humanistic approaches are of course valid. Okay, both valid ito. So it develops psychology as a science, and we use psychology as an art. Okay, now when we talk about mentalism, behaviorism issue, okay, Sikulohang Pilipino admits both, but with lesser emphasis on individual experience and of course with greater emphasis on the collective experience of people with a common bond of history. Okay, so there's a greater importance is attached to our psyche or our kamalayan. Thus, subsidiary importance attached to the lower level of physical consciousness or our ulirat. All right, and we have also here analysis wholeness issue, and it is okay. The analysis wholeness issue is not a big issue in SP or Philippine psychology or Psikolohiyang Pilipino. It is methodologically on the side of analysis, okay, but interprets the result of analysis with a bias for wholeness. Now, Enriquez said also or clarified, okay, also clarified that Psikolohiyang Pilipino is not inconsistent with a universal psychology. Okay, why? It is actually a step towards the development of a universal psychology. Okay, we are not saying that Philippine psychology is anti-Western. Okay, but it is not. Okay, it is not anti-Western theory and the methods either. No, so but against a non-selective use of imposition of Western knowledge. Okay, so the it rejects a non-selective use of imposition of Western knowledge. So um, it's not totally rejecting Western psychology. Okay, but then of course we reject the non we reject the idea of not selecting the right information that we will use here in the Philippines. Right? Now, its preferential focus on less elite Filipinos. Okay, sabi dito, great cultural divide in Philippine society between educated, westernized Filipinos and Filipino masses. Now, there's a great cultural divide indeed, no? When we talk about education, okay, and when we talk about social status. Now, Western-oriented psychology in the Philippines caters to the upper classes. That's why um, there's um, parang binabaliwala natin ang karamihan. This majority here in the Philippines, majority of us are not really from the upper class. We are from it's either from the middle and to the lower classes, right? So now Filipino psychology, okay, sabi dito, The real psychology of Filipinos will be found not in academic psychology, but on street corners, okay? Ano pa? In public markets, in rural barrios, and so forth. Okay? So when we say in street corners, we look at Filipinos. What are they doing? Okay? What do they do? As well as in public markets. In rural barrios as well, there are concepts or constructs that is really unique that it cannot be found in urban areas. Okay? So there are practices that is still really rich in culture and that is really useful when we talk about Filipino psychology. Right? Now, what are the defining characteristics of Filipino psychology? Okay, number one here is use of native languages is consistent with an indigenization from within approach. We already talked about the indigenization from within. Now let's add language, native language, right? So as we all know, indigenization from within or cultural revalidation is more of looking deeper, okay, looking at our culture deeper for us to understand, okay, okay, by using a language we would understand what is really meant by a um, certain concept, right? Now, native languages are an important source of indigenous constructs. Now, that's why native languages, when we talk about Filipino psychology kasi, no, we are supposed to be uh, teaching or we are supposed to be using Filipino language because that's our national language to teach Filipino psychology. However, okay, that's the practice in the University of the Philippines. However, here in our school, since we are catering different students from different countries, we use English instead. Okay, but then again, native language here in our country is an important source of indigenous constructs like the the concept of kapwa, okay, and that's the core concept of Filipino psychology. Kapwa, pakikipagkapwa, pakikibaka, pakikiisa, etc., etc. Right? Number three, the development and communication of an indigenous psychological science may benefit from the use of native languages. Okay, so the development and communication of an indigenous psychological science may benefit from the use of native language. So that's the importance of using the native language when we talk about, or that's the defining characteristic, I mean, of Filipino psychology. And lastly, reports written in native languages can reach a wider audience and contribute toward the development of national identity. Okay, that even you are far, okay, from the Philippines, okay, or you're abroad, okay, when your article is published and read by Filipino abroad, they would really understand that they are Filipinos, and by this article that you published, okay, would somehow elevate their national identity and consciousness. All right? So that's the defining characteristics of Filipino psychology. And that would end my discussion for today. And if you have questions, just ask in the comment section or you can send me a private message. Okay? Thank you and have a good day.